Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Who dat?
Yeah, I think Brandon's done a real good job. You know, he helps us out in all types of areas. Works with the nickels probably the most. Real good at helping Nick with the game plan and stuff like that. Does our ball meeting.
Niners head coach Kyle Shanahan this year talking about new Saints defensive coordinator Brandon Staley. News breaking on Friday, which we all expected that Staley was going to become the defensive coordinator of the New Orleans Saints. That now has been pushed across the finish line. Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints and LouisianaSports.net's been all over it. He's with us now. Yo, dude, how are you?
Hey, buddy, doing great. Glad to be here.
No surprise here with this news, but let me just get an opinion on the hire before we dig a little deeper.
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing for me and my biggest takeaway in this hire is I'd rather watch a team fail by trying something new than fail by continuously doing what has failed them in their past. And I think that a guy like Brandon Staley represents a big-time departure from the Saints' past when it comes to the defense in New Orleans that has struggled over the course of the past few years. So I like the hire. Is it going to turn them into a playoff team in 2025? Probably not, right? Like, this is a multi-year situation that we're looking at for Kellen Moore and his coaching staff. But I like what it represents in terms of a new path forward, new innovations, and new ideas.
Okay, how is Staley a new path forward from what they've been doing?
Yeah, so he effectively has worked throughout his career in what's called a 3-4 defense as opposed to a 4-3 defense. So a 4-3 defense would be 4 players on the defensive line, 4 defensive linemen, and then 3 linebackers up over the top. And then the 3-4 defensive approach kind of flips that. 3 defensive linemen, 4 linebackers, but 2 of the outside linebackers are guys that can rush the passer or drop back into coverage, while the 2 inside guys are typically coverage guys or run defense guys. And so it kind of flips your defense from being one that relies on big-bodied physicality and kind of takes it rather instead to a place of speed and athleticism, particularly at the edge rusher positions and things like that. So that better counteracts what it is that today's NFL teams are doing, which is the outside zone run, to where you're running outside the tackles, trying to get over to the edge. And the mobile quarterbacks as well, who, of course, have given the Saints a lot of trouble throughout their Dennis Allen defensive era. And so I think that Brandon Staley's defense and just the way that he utilizes his players and what that prototype is and everything, there's going to be a lot different about that approach under Brandon Staley than what Saints fans have become accustomed to seeing under Dennis Allen.
How does that fit the current personnel on the Saints defense?
To be honest, there are some players that fit and there are some players that don't. And so I would expect there over the course of the next few years, or let's say next 2 off seasons, to be quite a bit of potential turnover over on the defensive side. I think guys that get elevated by this are guys like Alontae Taylor and Kool-Aid McKinstry. Alontae Taylor could go back into the slot, play what's called the star role. We see it in college football all the time.
Sure.
Florida State, Florida have used that a bunch. And so you've seen that with, kind of the way that Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, for instance, was used years ago in the slots, where it was kind of this blend hybrid corner/safety. You could get Alontae Taylor, who was named the most disruptive player in the NFL early on in the season last year, until he got moved out back to the perimeter, and then he wasn't able to do the things that he did in run support, pass rush, all that. Remember, this is a guy that had, 3 sacks in the first game of the season?
Yeah.
That would put him back into that kind of role. Kool-Aid, this works out really well for, because kind of what's called the Rip Liz, which is just code for right and left defense that Nick Saban once used, that Bill Belichick has used in the past, but that Kool-Aid McKinstry played in under Saban, would be very familiar in terms of the rules of how to play in the secondary in Brandon Staley's defense. So guys like that get elevated. I think a slimmed down Carl Granderson as a stand-up pass rusher on the edge could be big. I think a guy like Isaiah Foskey, who they've been trying to change his what he did in college and change him to more of a 5-tech run stopper that can maybe bounce outside. This gives him an opportunity to do what it is as a Viper role, is what it was called, in Notre Dame, where he was a stand-up pass rusher around the edge. So I think there are some of those guys that kind of get elevated in this, but there are others that don't fit. And so maybe some of that change happens here in 2025, and then if not, certainly happens in 2026.
Would it be amazing if they could actually find value for Foskey? I mean, a guy that was a high second-round pick. Okay, who are the guys that don't fit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the guys, if you're looking at, is guys that are more quintessential three-tech defensive tackles. So the guys that typically line up in between the guard and tackle and are more pass rusher types. Colin Saunders, Nathan Shepard, those are guys that, there's going to be conversations about more than likely, because that defensive tackle is now either going to have to be able to bounce out to what's called a 5-tech, to where you're lined up over the inside shoulder of the tackle and crashing inside. It's a great spot for Brian Brzee, for instance.
Okay.
But, otherwise you want the big nose tackle, right? The big 320-pound Malcolm Brown, Sheldon Rankins, Malcolm Roach type that can line up over the center and change the numbers on the interior by making two guys block them to create those one-on-ones over on the other side. And so you got to find that mold, which I don't think the Saints have in the building right now.
Ross Jackson's with us. Get him on Twitter at Ross Jackson Nola. Give him a follow there. He's got a great piece up right now at LouisianaSports.net. If you want to go check it out, again, everything always free over at LouisianaSports.net. But it's effectively Brandon Staley's defensive scheme, bringing this fresh approach to the New Orleans Saints. Go read it right now at LouisianaSports.net. Does hiring Kellen Moore as the head coach and Brandon Staley as the defensive coordinator potentially change the Saints' outlook for free agency in the draft this year?
Certainly does, especially if they do, on the defensive side, take that leap into what I would call an odd man front. So it's not necessarily always 3-4. It could be like 3 down linemen, 3 linebackers, and then 5 DBs to get into your nickel looks and stuff like that. There's a lot of different things that they can do there. But I would say that the thing that it changes is the prototype for pass rusher. There's a big chance that ends up changing, and that kind of the slimmer, more athletic speed rusher all of a sudden has gained some value in Brandon Staley's system. You look at how successful he was with a Leonard Floyd, for instance, back in 2020, got 10.5 sacks out of him with the Rams. Think about I got to be careful about using this name, but you think about the Khalil Mack prototype, right? Not the actual player.
Hey, brother, getting Khalil Mack, yeah.
Right, yeah. So all of a sudden, the Khalil Mack to New Orleans pipeline opens up. But it's that archetype, right? The guy that can stand up and win with speed around the edge, that can transition speed to power when needed, but otherwise is just faster than the guy in front of him, and therefore can get to the quarterback. And so I think that value, or the value of that style of player, is all of a sudden now has a role in the defense. It doesn't change the prototype of what the team likes. It's just that the prototype is different for the role. And so at any point, you could look at the New Orleans Saints and say, well, what do you like in a speed rusher role? And they would tell you 6'3", 250, 240, 260, whatever it might be. But then you ask them, what do you like in your edge rusher role? And then they tell you, the towering 6'5", 280-pound guy. And the reason why the latter is more present in their defense is because that's what their defense called for. The scheme didn't call for a speed rusher. So now all of a sudden the defense might call for that. So I think that's a place where you could see some adjustment. And then over on the offensive side, I'm curious to see if Kellen Moore continues to lead into the biggest offensive lineman we've ever seen, like he did over with Philadelphia. It's where everyone's tall and enormous. And I'm curious to see if that ends up changing a little bit of what it is that they value, both starter and depth-wise, on their offensive line in the run game.
All right, 2 more things. One, and Ross Jackson's with us, Brandon Staley sort of had this parabolic rise because of the defenses that he had or the defense he had primarily in 2020 with the Rams.
Mm-hmm.
But he had Aaron Donald, and you mentioned Leonard Floyd, and he had Jalen Ramsey,
right.
And they were just incredibly talented. That ain't the Saints. So
right.
What's realistic to think of with the pieces he has, what it might look like in 2025? Another way to say it is, how much of that defense with the Rams was personnel? How much was Brandon Staley?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think a lot of it was personnel, right? You can have a good scheme all you want. You got to have good players. And so I think that that's a big part of what flipping the roster is over the course of this offseason and next offseason, is the attempt to go and get good players. Do you have to have the defensive player of the year? No, not necessarily. But do you have to have a good player at their position? Yeah, you do. And so I think you got to figure that out. And I think that that's a part of what's going to happen over the course of the next couple of years. I don't look at this as 2025 being the end-all, be-all, final form of what this looks like. I think you have to give it a couple of off seasons at the very least. But I will say this. Brandon Staley's the guy that looked Jalen Ramsey in the face and said, I'm moving you to slot, right? And put him in the position where he earned his all-pro recognition that season. He was technically a perimeter guy before then. Staley's the guy that moved him inside into that star position and then got him to be more disruptive and got his notoriety back as somebody that had all of a sudden been like moving around the NFL and everything from Jacksonville to there. And then, maximize what it was that he could do by putting him in a position to utilize his skill sets a little bit better. Same thing for Leonard Floyd, a guy that had begun to bounce around by that point. Said, okay, well, you've been asked to do this. Let's have you do this instead. And so I look at Brandon Staley very similarly to the way that I look at Kellen Moore. They do a very good job of understanding, or once they understand, let me say it that way, what it is that a player does well, maximizing that and putting him in position to do that. So I give Staley his credit for that, especially when he's able to be completely focused on a defense. I think it's different, and we've seen this across the NFL a ton. There are guys that are good head coaches, not so great coordinators. There are guys that are great coordinators and awful head coaches. And maybe Staley checks that box as somebody that comes in and is a lot better on the defensive side when it's all he has to focus on.
I mean, Dennis Allen was one. Don't let Brandon Staley handle clock management. Whatever we do, leave him out of end game scenarios. Okay, last thing. How big of a deal, or is it a big deal at all, the relationship with Staley and Kellen Moore?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you don't have many of these examples. At least I haven't been able to find many of these examples where a guy hires a guy, and then the guy that hired the guy gets fired, and then the guy goes somewhere else. And then the guy that got hired by the guy hires the guy that hired the guy. It doesn't happen very often. And so it's an interesting sort of relationship in that Moore was once Staley's offensive coordinator, and now Staley is Moore's defensive coordinator. But I do think that, if you have a connection that allows you to do that, to change roles and to flip and everything like that, I think that there's something to that. I'll use an anecdote. When I used to work in theater, we would do this all the time, where I would be the top stage manager on a show, and then we would do the show, and then that show would close. Then I would jump to another show, and all of a sudden, the person that I hired to be my assistant is the number one, and they're hiring me to be their assistant. And when you have that kind of connection with somebody that you're okay changing those roles and changing those hats, that typically shows a pretty good correlation or a pretty good familiarity with one another and a comfort with one another. And so for us, that worked very great in the creative field. How does that work in the sports field where there's a lot more ego? I don't know. But I think if you're willing to put that aside and join somebody's staff that you once hired, that maybe, if nothing else, what that shows you is that there's a really good relationship there between Moore and Staley, which could go a long way.
Ross Jackson, LouisianaSports.net, Locked On Saints podcast. That's wherever you get your podcasts, and on YouTube. Subscribe to Locked On Saints. Make sure you read Ross over at LouisianaSports.net. Always free. Again, he's got a great piece up right now. Again, everything always free, but it's a great column explaining how Brandon Staley's defensive scheme kind of is bringing this fresh approach to the New Orleans Saints from what they've been really for the last 15 years. So it's all there at LouisianaSports.net. All right, dude, thank you so much. Great work as always. Have a great weekend. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, man. Talk to you soon. Take care, Susan.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.